speaking of the flaws, I don't know if it is a flaw or not, but essentially what I've been thinking a lot about is essentially democracy is a system of the rule of the majority, right? And so obviously because of who I am and, my positionality within, a supposed democratic society or country, I'm often thinking about the ways in which that rule of the majority essentially disenfranchises and, eliminates a lot of the more minoritized perspectives.
Like a dilution. You know what I mean? It's like...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly within the context of what's happening now, right? There are... I don't know if you saw this, but the FBI essentially has a new internal memo where they're going after anyone who pushes for radical transgender ideology, as they would call it. And they're determining trans people or anyone who supports trans people as domestic terrorists. Right? And so I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which that, that majority, can, yes, dilute, a lot of the perspective for minorities, but also actively wield the system, against, these smaller demographics. And so, considering the presentation and everything that I had to say about Camp Lordsburg, that's kind of been stuck in my mind, quite a bit. And, obviously this kind of, extends and it affects other groups much larger than the trans community, such as, immigrants and, brown people. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with the democracy's flaws, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I think you capture something that I constantly struggle with as well, because a lot of my studies are immigration based, so I really do look at the relationship that the U.S. has with migrants and refugees, and in kind of the same connection with what you're saying of almost this oppression of transgender people through utilizing the system of itself, right? And I think what's interesting to me there is, again, when you're saying it extends outward, if we look historically at the relationship with how specifically immigration has kind of grown but also transgressed over the years through kind of this in practice, the actual what we believe to be due process and equal rights and all that kind of has shifted. And I think if we look at specifically with the civil rights movement, and with, yes, there being a big push for people of color and everything, there was still big inequalities with Native Americans. With Native Americans at the time, with women as well. You know what I mean? There was still this and so I wonder with what you're saying of what we see with this pressure currently on the transgender community, I think it does speak to something deeper, especially if we see with the current political community. I think it almost feels, at least from what I'm seeing currently, it's the right moment for an attack, if that makes sense. Because it does feel like we're so stripped of any shared ideals that it feels so easy, I think, to then use the system. Literally, an internal memo is crazy. I haven't heard of that. And I'm just wowed how just wow.
Well, I mean, this isn't necessarily even, a secret, right? This was something that Project 2025 very explicitly, talked about. If you go back to that document, it essentially states that any kind of trans representation, whether it be in the media or even in person, would be considered pornographic material. And so even just, myself walking down the street, that would be, considered indecent material. It would be pornography, so even just being trans is deeply sexualized within, this perspective. And so considering the kind of epistemological location of, 25 and just, the structure of power behind it, right? It really doesn't surprise that this is happening. Sorry, I was going to add something more, but I kind of lost my train of thought again. It's been a difficult week.
No, that's fair. That's fair. But yeah, and then you bringing up Project 2025. That's a whole other thing. And I think what's interesting to me is that that is a product of democracy, right? Like if we have to agree that and I think that's where I think I come in a little bit is like I mentioned on I think it was last Tuesday or Thursday. It's like this double-edged sword, right, that we have with democracy, right? Because we have to allow for enough space for us to feel freedom and equality, but also enough limitations to then, prevent us from doing anything that hurts us, right? And so I think we have kind of grayed this line, and we see it with Project 2025 of like what we view to be actually, just, or correct, and what we view to be kind of like just a natural part of the system, right? Because if you're able to put in something like Project 2025 and it, for the most part, be accepted, and actually be implemented, because Project 2025 is that constantly trying to be implemented, like it is, like I think it's crazy to me, and I think we have to kind of accept that that's like a part of democracy. Like that's where I think I come in as well. Like it's more of a hurting relationship, I think, in that sense. But I know you're going to add something.
I think I'm just trying to find, I don't know, just some point of like I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of like Project 2025 being a product of democracy and all that. I don't know where to anchor what I have to say. And I think this is more so related to a wider pattern that I've kind of been seeing, right? Where we tend to, like for example, in the presentation on Thursday, something that really stuck with me was something that one of our peers said. They said that there was, there's a huge advantage in being within the U.S. just because protesting is allowed. And so this really got me thinking about, if something like Project 2025 can be a product of democracy, then I don't really understand how we can consider, something like protesting as a part of democracy. In the sense that, particularly now with what we're seeing, there are people getting essentially arrested for, posing difficult questions or even for speaking out during, all kinds of community meetings, whether it be with local politicians, state politicians, or even like, at the federal level. Right? So, in essence, I find it really odd, for these two things to be, true at the same time, just because of the pushback that a lot of the agents of democracy, are essentially pushing towards protesting, whereas, something like Project 2025 is very much like welcomed, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is the hypocrisy of the system and the way in which it kind of funnels its own shortcomings into itself. In the sense that, like, our peers essentially consider the right to protest as some kind of, like, maybe like a silver lining of democracy, right? But it's like, in practice, that's not how it's actually, done, right? Like, that's not the reality of the matter, in the sense that, any protest, in order for it to be effective, it has to be disruptful, right? So how much are we robbing, how much power are we actually robbing from, the act or the practice of protesting by including it into a system that actively denounces it, right? Just because of the fact that, if it's allowed, then how disruptive is it?
Yeah. No, and I hope I can articulate myself here. You kind of see it in actual practice, right? Like, if you want to like boycott, right? Like, yes, you can boycott, but then you're also in a sense harming yourself, right? Like, I think, like, I'm trying to see how I can articulate this. Like, you're talking about like the shortcomings in how the U.S. has historically been able to kind of roll it over into itself, right? Like it's made it its own kind of power, and it's switched it, and I think with what we're seeing like now, especially in terms of protests, like you really do see a divide in the people, in especially what they view like protesting actually does, right? Because if you look at the actual value of it, like people view very different things that they're getting out of it. And so I think with like what I was trying to say with boycotting, like you're able to fight the system, but even if you fight the system, you're still in turn harming yourself, because the system is, at the end of the day, like what we become dependent on, right? And I think what we've seen is sort of the U.S. kind of take away in some liberty from the people, and they've kind of switched it in making it think that it's their own choice, right? And I think we see that particularly with, like, if you see in like people's decisions with like taxes specifically, right? Like I think people are very divided in what they believe is to be the right tax or whatever, and at varying levels how that impacts them. But at the end of the day, like you're only able. I had a point, but yeah, I think you're on a right track of like the U.S. has kind of rolled over its own like fallbacks and utilized it to kind of trick people into thinking that it's their own choice to take their own liberties away. You know what I mean? Like I think with COVID especially, like you see a big switch in legislation as well, with especially in Texas with them still utilizing a lot of like the legislation that they put through them, with like holding people due to like what they perceive to be like medical I don't want to say casualties, but like medical concerns, I guess you could say. Like
I'm not familiar with that. Could you
So
expand a little bit on that?
So like they utilize a lot of the legislation to actually pull people in to like test them and stuff, and do a lot of like because there was a case that came out, I think it was 23 or like late 22, where I don't know what you call them, like a medical place was utilizing the data that they were collecting from like blood samples and all that, to actually track like the
infection,
like not the infection, but the amount of like the demographics that were within that area. And so then they would actually like send that information, and you know where I'm getting at. Like they would send that information to other places, and so
they're kind of so in a sense, what they were doing is they were using healthcare as an excuse to collect data, to spy on people.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it just speaks to kind of like this like love-hate relationship that people have with the government and ideas of democracy, because now like especially with protesting, like now I think people don't even understand the importance of protesting, or like even if they see it, it's always just churned in you know what I mean? Like it's always like
it's almost like it's treated almost like the American pastime.
Yeah,
the alternative to baseball.
Yeah, like
right,
it's glorified for sure. Yeah, like I think
it's glorified and de-weaponized.
Yeah. It is really interesting, like how, and then now like people don't even actually protest to protest. They do it because it's cool, or like it's on social media. Like I think media for sure is a whole other conversation, but I think for sure like we've lost a sense of what protesting is, and with what you're saying, like is it even a part? Can we even say it's a part of the system? Like I don't think that it is, but it's sort of become like a component of. Like a tool that we use.
I think it's become a component of the myth of American exceptionalism. I think it's become a part of the myth of the American dream, right? Like this is what makes us great because we can do this, right? But it's like but when you really look at what protesting is, it's civil disobedience.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, when you compare the kind of protesting that we organize, right? Like, No Kings, like yes, it was like impressive in the sense of like the sheer numbers of people out in the streets across various cities and states, but it's like how effective really is it, right? Especially when you compare it to some of the stuff that like the French are doing, right? Like just recently, a few years ago, there was a very quite frankly shocking video, for Americans. Where, essentially farmers, I believe it was, they were dumping manure all over the homes of the their leaders in parliament. Yeah. Right? So, how effective is our protesting, and essentially, is this a part of democracy in the sense that, it works for the people as it's meant to, or is this a part of the system that, shields itself through democracy?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. And what are your thoughts on Nepal?
Nepal?
Like with their whole like revolting in their overtaking of their government. Do you think that
that's not fresh in my mind right now?
Yeah, no worries, definitely.
Can you remind me a little bit?
So essentially they took the opportunity to, essentially what the French did in the revolution, fighting against the government. There was a lot of videos going around showing just the mass amount of people really running, I think it was in the government square, and it was fire, they had essentially overtaken back their government through especially the use of social media. I think they connected over Discord or something, and that's how they got all prepared and did it on the day of. That I think was 6 months ago.
It was a student-led.
It was a student-led thing, yeah, and I think what you say there, I think it is sort of a component of the, protesting is a component that the government uses to kind of shield itself. And it's also very selective in its memory, I think, as well. Because if you look at textbooks, you hear about the civil rights movement, you hear about the workers' movement, but you don't hear about the actual blood, sweat, and tears that go into making those protests happen, right? It's just, oh, these people gathered and they spoke for their rights, and it was this and it was that. And I want to ask you on this idea of protesting requiring, I think, a level of willingness to go to the extremes, to some extent. What are your thoughts on what I like to call the Malcolm X approach or the Martin Luther King approach? What are your thoughts on that? And in terms of democracy and just how we view it?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a pacifist, right? Okay. My socialization at home was very much you never hit. And so I've kind of carried that, throughout my life. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that violence has its place, right? It's just not, that place is just not as expansive as we have been led to believe here in the West. And I'm speaking of the West just in terms of, the legacy of colonization and how that has informed gender, particularly the formation of masculinity within patriarchal society. And so through that reproduction of gender, violence is way too common, right? And I think that's one of the things that, my own parents were trying to shield me from, as I grew, right? And so now that I'm an adult and I see that, violence does indeed have, a place in society, particularly in, when we're talking about social justice movements, and when we're talking about larger revolutionary settings, or campaigns. I think that these two, essentially, these two perspectives, the pacifists and those that engage in violence, I think those kind of help each other, right? In essence, the pacifists' words are not going to land, as clearly, or as, they're not going to be as seductive without the threat of those that are willing to engage in violence, right? Yeah. And I think one of the ways that this is exemplified through, I wish I had this history a little bit more clear, but prior to the October 7th attacks within Israel, Palestinians had actually tried to engage in a peaceful resistance movement. I believe this was... Yeah, so this is the Great March of Return, where essentially Palestinians began to protest in Gaza, and this happened between 2018 and 2019. where they essentially, were challenging the blockade, and they were challenging the...
On the Gaza Strip?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think
Essentially, Israeli soldiers, just massacred them, right? And so, this kind of exemplifies that, right? And, what I've just said has no bearing on, how I feel about, anything that might have happened in October 7th. However, without that threat of violence, there's really nothing that, will, help a pacifist movement, essentially work its way through. And what I mean is, work its way through into dominant culture, just the modus operandi of society. And, even when you look at, the kind of movement that, gave me my rights, right? Like the deliberation movement essentially began, after, essentially, if I remember correctly, it was the mayor of New York City that wanted to clean up the streets right before election. And one of the ways that they wanted to do that was by essentially cleaning up a lot of the gay bars. Now, at that point, it was basically illegal to even rent a hotel room to, queer people. And, oftentimes the only bars that, gay people had to congregate in were bars that were owned by the mafia. And so this air of criminality and indecency, essentially gave green light for, the local government in New York City to essentially, bring in the cops. Previously, what would happen is the cops would show up on, some kind of weekday. There wouldn't be many people there. And so they would come in and they would, carry out their arrests. And then the mafia would just reopen, right? And so what ended up happening was, because they were trying to actively clean up the street, suddenly these cops started showing up to perform their raids during Friday night when it was super busy, right? And so the cops show up, on this night. And they, begin doing their thing. They begin bringing people out, arresting them after taking over the bar. And there was a lesbian that was being particularly rowdy. She was resisting, and the cops essentially started to rough her up right in front of a gathering crowd of people that essentially were showing up to, to the Stonewall Inn, to partake in the events, the social life. And people got angry. I didn't learn this until very recently, but apparently the gay community was reeling from the recent death of Judy Garland. And so, this coupled with this, very aggressive change in the way that NYPD was starting to police them, people began to throw pennies, copper. The cops, then pennies turned into bricks and, Molotov cocktails from, a few of the reports. And, essentially this, it was, if I remember correctly, it was 3 nights of just, an all-out riot. And it got to the point where police were overwhelmed chasing, groups of protesters and, rioters. And at one point, the NYPD showed up with their anti-rioting unit, and they were stopped dead in their tracks with a line of gay men dancing the can-can anthem. Right? And so where I'm trying to go with this is, violence is necessary sometimes. And it's necessary, because up until this point, queer people were seen as passive. They were the safe target that you could, go after. No one actually expected gay people or queer people to actually defend themselves, which explains why an entire group of, a riot unit, anti-riot unit was stopped dead in their tracks by, just a show of defiance.
Yeah.
Right? So, do I think that violence is, acceptable or that it has a place in everyday life? No. But it definitely has a place in, revolutionary movements. It definitely has a place in social justice movements.
I do agree. And I there's a lot, I think, to kind of unpack there, and I'm blanking out of, because what you're saying of this essentially your own kind of political force, this individual political weight that you're able to put onto the government. I'm really trying to find it right now. But there was another protest done in New York. I can't remember the exact name, but they had essentially I think chosen more the pacifist route. Doing what you can, like just sleeping in like a park, or like I think it was on the Wall Street strip. I think it was, and there was like a side, and they just were being a nuisance. I think in a peaceful way, and as much as we can say protests do help, I don't know how much that protest ultimately had an impact on I just don't think it had the impact that they thought it was going to have, especially within regards to the elite and this idea of consolidated power. Like, we still see that to this day, right? And I think, if we talk about boycotting is good, but ultimately these businesses will find business other ways, right? Like other places, and I think it is, especially if we're talking about the Malcolm X and the Martin Luther King approach. I do think at the end of the day, we have to put in that force, right? I just don't think we're not able to do anything without it. Nothing in the U.S. today is built from passive activity. It's constant, just pushback from society, and I don't know. I think we barely learn about that.
Well, I think one of the things that to keep in mind here, at least particularly when it comes to boycotting. When you really think about it, boycotting is an activity or a form of protest that is literally designed for the privileged, right? In the sense that, if you barely have enough to make ends meet, you're probably not going to have enough to, forego the cheap option and, go for the ethical option, right? Yeah. Which oftentimes just costs more, right? So, there's that aspect of it, which leads me to another point when it comes to protesting or any kind of civil disobedience, right? It's the illusion of safety. And I think this is something that was pretty evident on Thursday of last week when, essentially our peers were framing protesting as, just the fact that we're allowed to protest here in the U.S. as a kind of,
the silver lining,
plus for,
said,
for democracy, right? And it's the reason why the Stonewall Inn riots were so effective, right? It was because the people who were at the front lines, particularly the first night, were the people who had nowhere else to go, right? These were the trans women. These were the very effeminate, gay men who essentially had nowhere else to go, that were relegated to the streets in terms of turning tricks or doing sex work. Yeah. And so essentially it was the street queens that started this entire series of riots, and they started it because they had nothing left to lose, right? All the gay men and all of the lesbian women who could assimilate into a cis hetero way of life, particularly in that period. These were the people that were essentially blind to anything that was happening for those people, right? And it wasn't until the second and third night that essentially other more assimilated gay men and women started to join in, and it wasn't until the third night that Black Panthers were passing by and they were asking what's going on, and that's when onlookers would say, and this is the kind of language that was being used then, but essentially people on the street would say the queers or the faggots are essentially fighting the police. And it was through that shared, kind of sense of community, in the sense of we're both marginalized by the police, that then it became, a larger protest and a larger riot that started to incorporate other people from other walks of life. Yeah. Right? So, once again, how is it that, civil disobedience, by way of being allowed, how is it robbing, protesting from its actual political power? And how much of that, is actually being, essentially what I'm trying to say is that kind of the weaponization of the, protesting, is that the component that democracy claims? Right? Because, any protest, whether it's big or small, it disrupts something. which means that by definition it is violent, right? It's erasing or eliminating the kind of like modus operandi upon which, hegemonic, like peace kind of rests on, right?
Right. Yeah, I can definitely agree that, I can agree to all that, especially just how hypocritical the U.S. is with that too. Like they really try to claim that they're so, especially internationally. Like I think the last, couple of years we've been seeing a backsliding, a downsliding for sure. But yeah, like the U.S. is constantly tried to place itself on a pedestal. You know what I mean? Like it shaming even other countries for human rights issues or something like that. Even with the civil rights movement, like 1945, we joined this association, this organization built on this idea of equality, whatever, and then we are still constantly. 1994 is the last day that we have. Last year, that we have Native boarding schools for Native. Like that's decades after. You know what I mean? Now with Operation, to the early 2000s, Operation Streamline, too, with this massive exportation of migrants, right, from the U.S. and just a lot of mistreatment in that of itself with the expediency, I think, that came at the time with the Obama administration. And then now what we're seeing now. And I think it's just like I don't know how we even get away with it. Like, I don't know how we get away with it. And I think now we don't get away with it. Like, I think now you see a lot of countries saying, like, or even in their news, like, making jokes about the U.S. And I think, like, I don't know how we've ever built this idea and how we're still maintaining this idea. Because I'm curious, especially with social media nowadays, like, I'm not on it as much, so I don't know how huge that divide is, but I think it's pretty clear when you go, like, on that no matter what, like, it seems like there's a big divide in people, and so, like, we don't even agree on what is the right understanding, what is actually, like, the meaning of protesting, and how can we pull that collective. Like, I just don't think there's that foundation anymore for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a huge part of that is the push for consensus, right? I think that in and of itself is part of the issue, in the sense that when we push for consensus, we tend to consolidate all of our different options into what works for most of us, right? Which brings us back to the whole issue with democracy, right? In the sense that, like, the majority is going to have, just their way of thinking, right? And, just through that kind of positionality, right? Like, the majority is always going to be centrist, right? So where I'm going with this is, think about the way that, in us striving for consensus, think about the ways in which we disempower and devaluate a lot of the other more creative tactics, right? For example, think about how economic conditions essentially overlap with economic conditions and economic like necessities when it comes to, like, democracy at the local level, state level, and federal level. And how that has kind of led us to a position where we can no longer boycott, a genocidal state. Yeah. Right? Like, did that connection make sense?
No, it does.
Okay.
It does. So, from that, like, what do you think, like, where do we go from that kind of, like, understanding? Like, how can we kind of come at it from a different way?
Well, I think that, if trying to push for consensus, is kind of like disempowering our tactics, then maybe opening up space for, an otherwise would be better, right? And here I'm kind of drawing from decolonial thought, in the sense that, it's almost like creating a constellation of tactics and a constellation of various different groups with, their own, right? Like, this brings me back to something that I was saying in one of the very first classes, right? Where essentially the agents of democracy, or those that are in power right now, they're essentially all organized around one goal, one epistemological location, right? And they're very effective in using the system against marginalized people and, you know, anyone who doesn't agree with them, right? But they're not very good at defending, you know, each one of those like different elements in their MO, right? So how are we disempowering ourselves by you know, seeking consensus when we could all just be working, you know, along different, you know, along different points of that project? Does that make sense?
No, that does make sense, and I think we do tend, I think, to take the easy way out when it comes to that. Like because again, like it's this idea of expediency and, you know, wanting to make the most of our decisions, and so we're not making, you know, mistakes, and I think like a lot of with what democracy is kind of like, because it's like not, because democracy doesn't promise like an outcome, right? Like it promises like a set system of which you can use, and so it's kind of like and I think again this speaks to, you know, power of in itself, but we've made it so difficult for ourselves to even push back against democracy. Because again, like I was speaking, I think in the last group's presentation, of like this bureaucratic, you know, double-edged sword relationship that we have, where we're trying to limit harm being done to us, but then in turn we limit our own liberties and our own rights. And so I think it's interesting how, you know, we can like see that democracy doesn't guarantee like good outcomes, but it does guarantee like legitimacy of those outcomes. And so like we see like bad outcomes are still like democratic. And so it's like, again, with Project 2025, that's what it rounds back, right? And so it's like, I think we have a confusion of what, like we've meshed, I think, democracy and justice, you know what I mean, or ideas of, you know what I mean, like we can't split the two, you know what I mean, and so we can't move forward without that. I don't know what you think about that, but that's like, I think a lot of where we just feel, like where we hit a roadblock, and where we're not able to push forward, because now we're basing our questions of just what is, you know, again, basically, like what is justice, what is rights, like, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about this, you know, particularly when we look back at the history, you know, particularly World War II and, you know, that point in history, which really is the point in history that, you know, kind of like unites the idea of what democracy is with this idea of, you know, justice and freedom, right? Mm-hmm. You know, particularly thinking back to, you know, like Camp Lordsburg and that whole, you know, like, you know, like the hypocrisy surrounding that, and then, you know, the positioning of the U.S. at the, you know, the international
stage.
Yeah, the international stage. Yeah. Fuck.
No, you're good. You're good.
Once again, no, I lost my train of thought.
No, you're good, but I think I see where you're coming from, where, you know, especially with, again, I can't remember the court case at the time because I cannot pronounce the name, but around when Lordsburg was currently happening, there was a court case that had happened that essentially said what was happening was right, that it was legally allowed, and while the ambiguity of that decision left it, you know, kind of gray in practice, and we see a lot happen there, we can see how democracy can kind of justify, you know, horrific actions like that through the use of law. I don't know if that was kind of what you were trying to get at.
Yeah, and thank you. It actually reminded me of the direction that I was going. But essentially, where I was going is, I just lost it again. Damn it. No, but let me retrace my steps. Okay. Where I was going with this is the kind of like juxtaposition that we tend to hold democracy in with authoritarianism, or even like, you know, like economic systems like communism. Right, particularly through ideology that, you know, if you look back in history, like comes from that period, right? And like, this is kind of why I really appreciated that question that you posed for the group in terms of, you know, why is it that we've kind of assumed that, you know, democracy is, you know, like, you know, the more desirable system.
Yeah. Well,
right? Just because, you know, I think that juxtaposition, you know, kind of like robs, you know, a lot of possibility. right? Like it eliminates a lot of possibility, just, in the sense that, like, oh, you don't believe that, democracy is all these things, right? So, it's a little difficult to even challenge what, democracy is when you have democracy juxtaposed with, authoritarianism and, everything that the Nazis kind of, bring up.
Yeah. No, and then you're kind of ousted from the community for even challenging those ideas, because I think you're framed as I'm blanking on the word, but, like, for lack of a better term, like a crazy person, or like just, yeah, like I think it that's why it's also interesting, because it's, again, like, we say that we have this, like, shared idea of what justice is, of what equality looks like, but I don't know if we do, like, at least in the sense that a shared understanding that we can have, right? And I think that speaks to so many issues with just education and socialization and all that. But I think it is really interesting just how, because then that also speaks to, like, again, like, we're assuming, right, that democracy is the best option. But it also falls on the people, right? It depends on the people of that society to keep that society running. I think that's like a basic understanding that we have, but we, like, in turn are, again, limited in the pushback that we push towards, like, these thoughts that we have. And I think, again, it's this environment that's been created, like, especially with, like, Lordsburg and, like, the Pueblo, and, like, being able to hear their history. Like, you don't ever hear any of that or, like, see any of that. And I think it's interesting just how detached I think we are from that, like, political world. So, like, now, even if we do see the flaw, we don't feel like we have a way to protest, or, like, you know what I mean? Like, we don't see any value in it. And I think that's, I don't know if that makes sense. Like,
No, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what's coming to mind now is something that I was seeing online, particularly around the time that the No Kings protests were, like, in full swing. And this was something that was, like, a lot of, like, organizers were talking about, and, analyzing videos of, like, people protesting. And it's like, because we've weaponized the idea of protesting so much, people are not being careful, right? And it's because of the illusion of safety that people were not being careful. They were showing up to these protests with their family, not covering themselves up at all, right? So this kind of, like, highlights the issue again, right? Like, this idea of, like, the illusion of safety and just how much it actually means. And this is reminding me of a conversation that I had with a friend, where essentially she was triggered by another classmate that was very Marxist and very much like, let's challenge the system, right? This other person is an organizer. So her whole thing is to push people into action. Right, and I remember my friend saying, like, like, she was very anxious about this girl essentially, seeing the threat of violence in the words that this woman was using in class setting.
yeah.
And I remember my friend saying, like, I'm just not ready for that, right? And it's like, you're not ready for what? Like, violence is here.
Well, yeah, and then people, like, no, I think you touched on a great point. Yeah, like, I don't know if disillusioned is the right word. Like, we're just detached from reality. And I think we are also detached from this, like, the actual severity of things that are going around us. And I think that speaks a lot to social media, especially. Like, I think if you're constantly, like, if bad things are constantly, like, pushed down your throat, it ultimately just becomes normal, and you don't really see, you don't see what happened with the Gaza Strip, the mass amount of shootings. You don't see all these crimes as severe or as important as they actually are. And I think and I don't know, because I think about that too, just, like, in the idea that, like, what I think now of what is happening in, let's say, Israel between Iran, like, I think we feel a detachment from any, like, action, again, because we're so, like, polarized in the national that we forget about the the local. And that's why I was actually really grateful for the class, because I think you're able to see like the little things that you are able to do to kind of get the wheel roll like going, and to actually be able to be a part of these like conversations, and to, I think, feel that sense of connectability and purpose. And I don't know if that maybe speaks to like what that person maybe hasn't seen, because I think a lot of like challenge the system is that you've never actually seen particularly what happens inside that domain. But I think there has been kind of that shift in social perception of like, yeah, a social perception of like us, you know, being able to connect, you know, because I think a lot of people also feel like they're just going to be hated for speaking against like traditionally what they view, right? And I think we police ourselves constantly, and we, you know, obviously each other, but we constantly police ourselves, and I think that also limits ourselves. Like there's been this, I'm blanking on the word, but this social environment that kind of taints any opposition as well. You know, I think that social media has a big part of that.
Social media has a really interesting role to play, and I think its role is more so exacerbative than anything else, right? Because at least through the dimension of like connecting people across, you know, like regions, across oceans, right? Like I think it has an exacerbative effect in the sense that because of the way that social media is built, you know, through essentially it creates echo chambers through its what's it called? Through its algorithms,
Yes.
right? Like it can have an exacerbative effect in that sense, and also an exacerbative effect in the sense that, like, you know, people's like goals, whether it be to inform or mislead, you know, misinform, disinform, right? So I guess what this is leading me more towards is just how often these conversations about systems are actually conversations about culture.
And in what way? Like,
well, think about it. Like it can't be a coincidence that, you know, we have who was it? Was it Coates who wrote that piece about the hypocrisy in the founding fathers' hypocrisy?
oh yeah, I think it was.
Right? Like, it can't be coincidence that we see that level of hypocrisy there, you know, in using, you know, the founding fathers using slavery as, you know, a kind of like point of harm or indignant, like, you know, treatment by, you know, the government in Europe, particularly England, right? And then seeing it in the U.S.'s like kind of activities, and, you know, and with Camp Lordsburg and the, you know, the rest of the internment camp like system, and then its positioning as, you know, a liberator of the concentration camps, you know, when it comes to like, you know, Nazi Germany. Not to mention the way in which, you know, as you said, like, you know, these are all just patterns of essentially the system like creating its own legitimacy for its actions, right? So you know, these are these are examples of the same thing occurring across time, even though, like, you know, material realities have changed quite a bit, you know, from that point, right? So oftentimes these conversations are very much about the kind of culture that is guiding the systems across change.
Yeah, and how do you even? Because then that also speaks to like the, you know, the solidifying kind of culture that is maintaining itself, right? Like I think, especially now, you see it. Like we're speaking of this difficulty of challenging the system, it's so even difficult to get into the system to speak onto that, right? Like I think, I don't know if you're going to say, but like it's interesting just how, you know, like, especially if we take into consideration like voting and all that, like there's a big mismatch in our equality to actually enact influence onto the system, right? And I think it's interesting with like this culture, like how do you even like go into that with, again, the intent of doing good? Because I think also, like, I don't know why, but like with government and with power, obviously, like you become corrupted, you know, depending on like the value system that you have. I don't like, especially nowadays when we're I think in this kind of like one-on-one against each other, this dog-eat-dog world where, you know, especially in the prevailing times, like we feel like we kind of have to rely on ourselves. Like there's this polarization in the political world, but also this isolation, right, that we feel as we're, you know, stressed with work, you know, with you know, if you're going to school, with all these stressors that you have in your life. I just think, like, again, we're not even impacting the culture now. Like the culture is literally maintaining itself. Like I don't know if do you think there is opposition or that is like seeping in, or there is a shift in culture? Specifically, I know like with the transgender community, which you're speaking a lot recently, with a lot of changes going through. Like how do you view that age?
Is the question whether I see a shift in culture?
Like a shift in culture in particularly like in practice, do you see currently, you know, shift in culture?
I mean, it's interesting that you phrase this question like this, right? Because before we started, I was talking about, you know, my research, and this particularly brings up Bourdieu's concepts of habitus, fields, and capital. Essentially, Bourdieu calls habitus, or his idea of habitus is. Let me bring up. Yeah, so essentially, it's kind of like a set of situated subconscious attitudes and predispositions that guide action through intuition. And this is action that comes about through uncertain environments, right? And so, in essence, Bourdieu himself describes habitus as systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures, that is, as principles of the generation and structuring of practices and representations which can be objectively regulated and regular, without in any way being the product of obedience to rules. And so in essence, what this kind of highlights is the way in which people navigate uncertainty, and they do it by essentially through this set of, predispositions, and is the way in which people navigate, that come about through the way in which people move through the world, and how they navigate masculinity, femininity, how they navigate the education system, how they navigate, various other areas of life. And that's essentially what fields are, right? Like fields are areas of social, what do you call them? Areas of social influence. And so, in essence, what this kind of highlights is the way in which people decide to either support the kind of modus operandi that is being guided through habitus. Highlights is the way in which people decide, and the way that that's challenged is through how we relate to what Bourdieu calls capital, or the thing that is collected and coveted, and that comes to shift our positionality, right? So if we're talking about, for example, economic capital, we're talking about the ways in which people have become successful in accruing economic capital, and how those actions kind of come to inform a situated way of viewing the world. Right? And so in essence, that kind of creates a kind of dominating culture that, guides all of these individual actions from individual people towards a set goal without explicitly guiding people. Right? Yeah. So am I seeing a shift in that? Yes and no. Yes and no, in the sense that, much like any other point in history where, social change is actively happening, there's always going to be people who are going to be resisting that change, and they're going to be, supporting the current modus operandi, and then there's going to be people who are going to be challenging that, right? So is there a shift? Yes, in the sense that there's kind of a tug-of-war kind of happening now, right? I do think that the shift is kind of heading in a good direction, in the sense that as the federal government continues to act in the way that it has been acting, and the way in which those actions continue to illuminate, as the federal government continues to act in the way that it has been acting, and, we're starting to see a shift towards, the right side of history, quote unquote. Yeah. But it's too soon to really see where it's going to go.
No, I agree, for sure. And I have similar, lines of thinking, especially with what you're saying of sort of this because kind of what I'm seeing a lot more recently is a lot more questions from people, questions about whatever it is. It's at least questioning the system. And so I hear people, especially like in my family, friends who have never really thought about politics ever, actually ask, like, why is the government doing this? Why is the government doing that? And so I share, in your sense, there's, because that's obviously what I see communally, but also what you see nationally, right? This divide, it's this tug of war, right, of two different realities that you're seeing. And I want to kind of like build on that and say, like, I think it's good that I think the divide is good only if we best utilize the opportunity to rebuild, right? Like it's about how we then come back. And so I think with low trust in government, it doesn't necessarily reflect that like we're in a crisis, because I think without it, like now what I see constantly is like, oh, there's this divide, it's chaotic, right? But I think if it's mediated chaoticness, it that does lead to productivity, right? And I think it leads to this momentum that builds. And so like governments can, I guess like what I'm trying to get at is like there's productivity, right? And I think it leads to this system, right? And I don't think that weakens it, but I think it's building this foundation for us to actually question and to push back. And like I don't know if that is a natural outcome of transparency, like of criticism, right? That distrust is necessary for us to be able to prompt something out of us, right? To like, that distrust is necessary for us to.
The point in history where the colonists essentially, like rebelled against the King of England, that whole system, right? Like they did so because of distrust, and it was distrust that was earned, right? And so, like the entire system that we've come to know as the U.S. democratic system was born through distrust. Right, which I think is why the U.S. System that we've come to know as the U.S. through distrust, right? Which I think is why the U.S. from one of the world wars. I think the one that particularly it was the Second World War, because it was the U.S. involvement in the Second World War that essentially like brought it out of the Great Depression, right? And I think from that point on, like. Because the U.S. was at such a point of economic instability, it was within its interest to kind of like generate that idea or that sense of patriotism, right? And it kind of like revived it from the kind of like patriotism and trust in the government that came out of the just the establishment of the government right after winning independence. So. In a sense, I find it really interesting that, from that point to like World War II, that there's this kind of like erosion of distrust that is shaped into trust that has led us into this position. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So, if you go back to what, the actual, like, structure of government is, it's built on checks and balances. And that in and of itself speaks to distrust.
No.
Right, like
if you look at the founding fathers, like writings and the actual declaration, like it alludes to this idea that you will be exploited at some point, like that someone in power will. You have the ability to take these people out of power. Obviously, there's going to be some distress in there, like and I again, yes, like I think we again take the easy way out and we say, oh, but it's the best option, right? Oh, but it's helped us, right? Oh, but it's worked. But at the end of the day, like we don't know how much like there is, to explore and to actually like learn of. Like we've limited ourselves so much, and I know we're getting. I think we've hit the hour mark for sure. Let me read the last question because I do want us to kind of think looking forward. Is democracy still attainable in the 21st century? Will it survive? And then how can we reform it? So this is a loaded question, and I feel like I don't know if we're going to get to an answer, but I want to hear your thoughts of like What do you think about where we're heading?
Well, it can't be a coincidence that, the U.S. is not just considered, a country or a state, right? But it's considered an empire, right? And it can't be a coincidence that, we've reached the 250 point, the point of 250 years, which is kind of like the rough point where like empires kind of like fizzle out, right?
Yeah.
And, this isn't to say that, the U.S. is going to end, right? Because no, like the English Empire, right? It dissolved, but England is still very much, like real. It's existing, whatever.
Yeah,
it's there.
It's there.
Right? But this brings me back to England is still very much. Specifically, this text by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, where she essentially proposes hospicing modernity. And from at least from my point of view, democracy is a part of that like idea of modernity. And so what she's talking about is, or what she's proposing rather, is the creation of systems that help modernity die with grace. And what this means is creating systems that are going to hospice modernity, but also are going to be there to help people as they shift from dependence of one system, as you were saying, into this otherwise. Because essentially modernity tends to universalize, it tends to, seek consensus, right, in a kind of way. So, in this sense, what she's talking about is allowing for the opening of spaces and systems that, are not necessarily going to be working with one another or against each other. They're just going to be existing, right, and doing their own, kind of thing, right? So, is this democracy? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like, is the EU a democracy?
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is kind of where, like, we get to that, like, how difficult is it to, like, challenge democracy in the sense that, like, is it, worth attaining?
So I do agree, and I think what speaks to me most true currently, and at least what I'm seeing, with obviously democracy, like we said, we're given the equality of opportunity, and so in turn, we're able to elect our own representatives, and I think it's one of those cases where we've pinned ourselves in a really uncomfortable spot by electing Trump, and we're kind of seeing now like this fascist approach to power, right? Like we're seeing America, like the United States, shift dramatically in how not only it's perceived but also just how it's used at the end of the day, right? Like now you don't see the government actually being as like a good guy and a bad guy. You really only see it through one lens, which is typically, like, at least again that's subjective, but I being as like a good guy and a bad, like at least events in Hungary with their election, right? Then being a parliamentary, democracy, they essentially were put in that same pinned position, right, of electing a leader who ultimately erased, like years and decades of proved that, how that of Hungary had progressed, right, and so they had gone back to essentially level one, and I do think we were seeing, like, now, like, with what I know one of the group presentations was saying, like, we're seeing America tested, right? Both in its ideals and also just one of the group presentations was saying, like, we're seeing people come out for who they really are, and it's essentially another. I think this is like we're really going to see the 21st century reflected in either a really good way or a bad way, because we're at a pivotal moment where we dictate of are we going to keep backsliding, or are we going to stop right now and do something or whatever that we can, and I think that's where it's like, that's where I'm at, right? Like I think that's like the pivot I think that we need to start making.
Well, I mean, I do think that there's
like the
typically when it comes to just a system as large as, what the U.S. has in terms of like the federal level of the government, right? The weight of history is something that is very real. And we saw that when we went to Albuquerque and we met with I believe her name is Josette Monet.
Believe so, yes, yeah.
Yeah, but essentially she...
I can't remember.
They were at the New Mexico Department of Indian Affairs.
Oh, yes.
Josette Monet. And essentially she was talking about how, just it was the weight of history that, forced the use of the term Indian to continue to describe like anything related to like Native American affairs or Native American legislation, right? And so the silver lining that I see in this sense is like when you get leaders, like the leader in Hungary that you were mentioning, or like even Trump, right? They're like bulls in a china shop, right? Like they're just going to destroy and they're going to, and in a sense, this in a way does kind of erase that, like weight of history, right? Like, so in a sense, yes, he's being very destructive and he's being horrible, to just the well-being of the country, right? But also, is he kind of doing us a favor, right? Like, because as he continues to destroy, there's going to be gaps in the system. So that's the silver lining. But then something else that kind of worries me is, have we challenged the cultural reality of the system enough to, actually go in and rebuild through, another lens or through, another lens or with other goals, right?
Yeah, no. That's just exactly what I'm saying of like, right now we're seeing where people are going to be tested and they're going to have to make a decision and we're going to see,
right?
Yeah, no. That's just exactly what I'm saying, seeing where people are going to be tested and they're going to have to make a decision and we're going to see,
right?
Yeah, no. That's just exactly
come out of Minnesota, right? The ways that people there realize, like, we're much stronger as a community, right? And suddenly the lines that divide individual from individual, like, they just kind of melted away, right? Particularly when it comes to, like, the noise protests in the middle of the night. Divide individual.
Yeah. I am hopeful that people will kind of open their eyes and at least confront the unknown and that uncomfortability, because that's really where open their eyes and we're just seeing a lot of roadblocks, and I don't know, I think for sure as long as we keep pushing forward and having these conversations, like I think that's what I will take with me for sure out of this class, is like having these conversations is so crucial, because man, like the amount of just misunderstandings that one can have and the confusion that one can build in their own minds of what they want to understand but never can, So
yeah, I mean, if it makes you feel any better, I've definitely described this period of time that we're kind of living through as the time of disillusionment, right? And it's because, a lot of these notions or ideas of what we had, of what that we had about what the country was, right? Like the American dream and all these things, like they're slowly, like dropping. Yeah. And it's kind of triggering like a domino effect, right? So, yeah, I mean, I am cautiously hopeful, but not optimistic.
I think that's the best, honestly, way to frame it. Because, I think as much as you try to pull your own, like, hope, like, there's really only one hope, and it's that, really. But yeah, I think that concludes us for today. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to share, or...
No, not really. I mean, if anything, I think unless you would rather do that now, I was just thinking that I would do the intro. I don't know if you're okay with me doing it like at home and independently, or do you want to do this together? Because I know we didn't really open.
Yeah, no.
It's up to you.
We can do it real quick if you like. Yeah,
sure.
I do need to.
Yeah, I figured.
And head in a little bit. I just have to make it somewhere before 5, but I'm in the building at least. So.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. How did you want to do it?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bitchical Cynic. My name is Lilian Montoya, and I'm here with Ruben Morales.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hello, and this will be our last podcast, so I hope that you've enjoyed us speaking and that you're going to enjoy us speaking today.